Hey there, my name's Sebastian, and this is Talk That Pod, a podcast where I have conversations with some of the most interesting podcasters in the world. My guest today is Joni Deutsch. Joni has spent 15 years shaping the way we discover, grow, and think about podcast promotion. She's the Senior Vice President of Marketing and Audience Development at the Podglomerate. It's an award-winning podcast agency that has helped shows from PBS, NPR, Netflix, Harvard, and many others reach hundreds of millions of listeners. Joni, welcome to the show.
Sebastian, thank you for having me.
Of course. Okay, so first question. So you lead marketing and audience growth for what seems to be a pretty diverse set of podcasts, everything from large organizations as well as independent shows. I'm curious, is there sort of a universal playbook that you run for promoting a lot of these podcasts, or is the plan different for every show?
It's a great question. And you're right. The Podglomerate, in nearly 10 years that this company has been around, has represented a wide range of marketing clients, from major Fortune 100 companies and brands like Microsoft or CBS to institutions like Harvard Business School, Stanford, even NPR, PBS, public media stations, and for-profit entities and freelancing. The list goes on and on and on. But the point being that when we approach a marketing campaign or an audience growth and strategy campaign for any show, there's some basic tenets of that work. The first and biggest one is that we need to figure out, from the client's perspective, what are their goals with this campaign? Their goals may be very different. Maybe their goal is to get to the top of the podcast charts, or to be featured in a major media outlet, or maybe it's just simply we want to grow our show's audience. We may not have the exact number, but we want growth for the show. So once we have that understanding in place, then the pillars of our work are pretty standard, but we can customize them based off those specific goals and also what the client would like us to do. And those pillars basically are 6 elements of work. One being publicity. So the fact that we look at ways to position the show and or its host or episodes for feature coverage and media outlets and email newsletters like Find That Pod, to be able to talk about the show or interview its host. We also do marketing. So we look at what are the ways in which the show, maybe it's a major outlet, has all sorts of channels: social media, website, newsletter, radio, television app, to be able to optimize those channels to adequately promote the show and leverage its pre-existing audience to come to the podcast feed. Our third pillar of work is cross promotions. So looking at other podcast entities and how we can cross promo with them. So 30, 60-second swaps, trailer drops, episode feed drops, and the like. The fourth being podcast apps. So we have strong relationships with Apple, Spotify, and the other editorial teams at other apps that we can see about securing earned features, those carousel features, the collections during specific times of the year. If a client has paid advertising, then that's the fifth pillar of our work. So we can leverage that paid advertising budget, if it's $100 or $1 million or anywhere in between or higher or lower, to promote their show with paid advertising in podcast apps, in podcast feeds, in newsletters or other channels. And then the sixth and final pillar of our work is data management. So I mentioned at the start that we focus on KPIs, or the goals of the client. If their goal is, we'd like to grow our followers by 20%, or we want to get 1 million downloads, well, we need to track that. So we have a tool, a dashboard, to be able to track all sorts of stats, from episode consumption completion rates to plays, downloads, views if they're on YouTube or have a video podcast. And all of that together can give us a sense of how effective our campaign has been. But you're right, though. Some campaigns, they may not want certain elements of our work, so we can customize that to fit their needs and goals.
Okay, I want to zoom in a bit on a couple of things you just said there. The first thing is, it seems to me, you mentioned those 6 pillars. It seems to me that a bunch of that work would probably be sitting on top of sort of work that you've done previously for other clients, networking, building relationships. How important are those relationships to you in executing that client work?
Very important. That's one of the things that I've found in the 15 years I've been working in media, audio, radio, communications, is that relationships are so key in order to grow together, right? The people that I met 15 years ago at the start of my career are still people I'm in touch with today. Even if their positions have changed, the organizations have shifted or been acquired even. It's it's likely that those people are still working in and around this line of work of podcast and, journalism and discovery of storytelling. And, knowing that you have someone on the other side of your email inbox who's receiving your email and is already receptive to you as a person and knows you and the value you can bring to them is so key. Because nowadays, I don't know if you're like me, Sebastian, but I receive so many emails in my inbox, not even pitches, just simply emails.
Yeah.
And the time I have to read through all of them is so limited. So when I see an email from an individual I know that's asking me a question or requesting a cross promo or an editorial exchange, that means more to me, and I'm going to click on that and be able to do something with it versus someone that I have no connection with. And that's a relationship I would start from the ground up, and that's trust I have to build.
Sure.
So that's a big tip for anyone listening, is that if you are wanting to get into publicity or marketing communications, even just little touch points you make with someone, like a LinkedIn follow request that you then follow up on every few months to say, hey, how are you doing? Let's grab a virtual coffee. It makes a world of difference if you want to secure maybe a larger feature collaboration down the road.
For sure. And the second thing I wanted to ask you about is that sixth pillar you mentioned, the data management.
Yeah.
I'm curious where those data sources come from. Is it you're pulling on APIs from some of the big platforms? Where does that data come from?
Yeah, it's a great question. So for our dashboard that we're using, it's pulling from a few sources. Apple Podcast Connect, Spotify for Creators, the hosting platform of the show in question, and hosting platforms vary. So it could be Megaphone, it could be Simplecast, it could be Dovetail, it could be, there's so many out there. And then if the show is on YouTube, then we're also pulling from their YouTube creator account. So between those four sources, and again, Apple, Spotify, and if they're on YouTube are three of the biggest platforms for video. And Sebastian, I'm so sorry. My dog is here with me, and you've probably been seeing his tail wag. Give me 1 second. I'm just going to move him out of the room. So
I welcome furry friends on the podcast.
He's like, I want to chime in on data and podcasts.
That's right.
We pull from a few different sources. Apple Podcast Connect, Spotify for Creators, the hosting platform of the show in question, which could vary. Some shows are on Megaphone or on Simplecast or on Dovetail or on Podbean or on Buzzsprout. There's so many out there. And the fourth source being YouTube, if they are on YouTube with video content. Between those four, so the hosting platform being the one that is going to have the RSS downloads across all apps, and then the Apple and Spotify, which are two of the biggest audio and now I guess you could say video platform sources along with YouTube. That gives us a wide array of metrics to look at for how the show is performing, not just for marketing purposes, but for production. So for instance, with episode consumption completion rates, we're able to see, well, on Apple, the show is getting maybe 40% completion. And on Spotify, it's getting 35%. And on YouTube, it's getting 10%. Well, based off industry benchmarks, that's actually low across the board. So probably we need to talk with the production team to determine, hey, can you maybe rework the format, the structure, the first 5 minutes of the show, because we want to get episode consumption rates higher to be able to help us with our marketing efforts as well.
Yeah, that's a really good point. And I think, speaking of YouTube, it's probably one of the reasons why a lot of podcasters are attracted to it also, because their data analytics have been excellent for years. And I guess that's sort of ported over to podcasts now. I'm curious, when a new client walks in through the door at the Podglomerate, what are the things that you're sort of looking at in terms of, aside from their goals, how do you evaluate their growth potential and what you think they can do?
Yeah, we look at it through a few lenses, I guess you would say. And I should also be clear that with the Podglomerate, while marketing is one of our arms, our divisions of service, we also have production, video and audio, and we also have monetization, ad sales. So a prospective client coming in may utilize all three of our service lines, or two of the three, or just one of the three. And that's in a conversation we would want to have with them to determine then, what are their goals across the board, or how can we work with them to accomplish that through our respective lines of service. For marketing purposes, though, if prospective client comes to us, we actually have a pretty comprehensive form that we have them fill out. So that way we can get a better sense of how serious they are about marketing and audience growth and strategy for their show, whether it's a show they're about to launch net new or a show that's been around for a while and they're wanting to really help with avoiding audience churn and helping like get it back up and running in a strong position. So once they fill that out and we have basically a little call with them to figure out like how we can work together between their timeline, if that aligns with our capability to take them on as a client, because if they want us to work with them tomorrow, we probably can't work with them tomorrow. We need some lead time to get things up and running, to their budget, to again, the conversation of goals. And is that feasible with, realistic with what we can offer them? That's when we take it from there to determine, do we move forward together? Or do we just simply say, hey, we're happy to stay in touch about cross promotions or other things. Going back to the relationship conversation, sometimes we have prospective clients that for whatever reason don't work out. Well, we're still in touch with them. Maybe we do a cross promo, a fee drop, a guest swap down the line.
Yeah. A few of your clients, the 13th Step, it was a Pulitzer Prize finalist. And I believe another one of your clients, Bear Brook, which is an excellent podcast, was called the best true crime podcast by Stephen King. Mm-hmm. So when you have a show that achieves that level of sort of recognition, does the marketing strategy kind of change or kind of latch onto that a bit more? Do sort of awards for shows kind of move the needle on listenership?
Yeah, great set of questions. And you're right, New Hampshire Public Radio, who's one of our clients, not just for marketing, but also for monetization and ad sales, they have produced a wide array of exceptional podcasts over the years, including Bear Brook, which is also one of my personal favorites. Before I even joined the Podglomerate, I was listening to that show, and 13th Step, among many others. And you're right, too, that we've had the honor of representing shows that we've been able to secure, either awards and or recognition, like Stephen King having that great praise for Bear Brook, or The Guardian calling a show a must listen, or the New York Times featuring a show. Whenever those opportunities arise, those accolades, those best of list moments, we pretty quickly integrate that into our publicity funnel. So, for instance, if a show was named one of the best of 2026 by The Atlantic, we would immediately take that reference and put it into the next round of pitches we'd be sending out to podcast apps, to cross promo partners, to media outlets to say, hey, since we last spoke, not sure if you saw exciting news, our show just got featured on this list or by this entity. Would you also like to feature them? Would you like to talk to the host of the show? A crowd attracts a crowd. So when we're able to see a feature, we are pretty quick to say, well, that's going to go right into, feeding the marketing machine, if you will. Mm-hmm. As for awards, I think awards really depend on the goals of the client. So I have been a juror on a number of these awards. I have won a few of these awards. I can see the impact and value of a show entering themselves into a category or into an awards competition. But I would also caution the shows out there thinking like, oh, if I get an award that's going to change my entire career in audio and podcasting, it might not. It very likely might not. What it will do, though, is give you a few platforms to stand up on a higher way. One being you are getting your show out to people that are probably stakeholders in a larger position in podcasting. So, for instance, jurors who are executives at companies or high-level, individuals, they're reviewing your work. And that might not be someone who naturally knows about your work or listens to it or sees it. So when you enter, you might have someone like myself or others listen and think, oh, I'd love to get in touch with the show to see about a cross promo or to see about acquisition or distribution or monetization. So that's a positive. And also, awards do attract acclaim to some degree. Podcast apps actually like to create categories and collections for winners when those winners are announced. Pocket Cast, Apple Podcasts, and a few others. So if you do win an award, like a Webby Award, a Signal Award, an Ambi Award, it's possible that you're going to get a podcast app feature from it or another feature from a media outlet. And that's press and publicity that, as I was just sharing, you can leverage to help grow your show with your audience. So it's not necessarily going to cause you to gain 100, million listens overnight. But if you're strategic about it, if you're wise, then it could probably do you some good.
I know it's not all of them, but I've definitely seen some podcast awards charge for entry, whatever that may be. I'm wondering how you feel about that, because I have a particular opinion about it, but I'm curious about yours.
Yeah. And we have, for those curious, we have a list of podcast awards on our website. If you go to podglomerate.com/media, it's a pretty comprehensive list of the ones that we would recommend as like, let's say high level awards or reputable awards, ones where there's some weight to it because of the jurors, because of the previous winners and entrants. That I have been seeing media awards and journalism awards for many, many years that usually at minimum will cost, $25, $50 for an entry. Even some of the most prestigious media journalism awards have that cost. They're not free. I have noticed that some more digital media and podcast specific awards in recent years have charged much more than that. So in the hundreds of dollars, and assuming you get the regular early entry fee rather than the late fee at the very end of the competition round, which, obviously that will increase significantly. So at the end of the day, I do think that putting in some fee for like the service fee of the website of the awards to be able to exist, it helps keep that up and running. Or for the staff of the awards competition to be able to be paid for admin purposes, they can continue facilitating this. The larger question of what should an award cost for an entry? I don't necessarily think that it should cost $1,000. I would think that we want to keep things affordable because there's so many great podcasts out there. Some of them are independent podcasts or indie podcasts, smaller podcasts. They're not the New York Times of the world. They're not the NPRs or the major networks or, tech bros. So I would want it to be equitable for them to feel like they have something that they're proud of to submit for entries, and it's not cost prohibitive for them to, not be able to be a participant in it.
So here we are in 2026, and I don't know what it feels like to you, but to me, podcasting feels both more crowded and more niche in the sense that there's a lot more podcasts coming in to fill what you would think are tiny niches, and yet somehow they find some sort of audience. How do you feel about the topic of podcast discoverability? Because I think it's changed. When I first started Find That Pod almost 7 years ago, I felt like there was a real gap in the market. I think it's changed a bit. I think the major platforms are doing a slightly better job of the way they sort of apply some sort of editorial layer on top. You definitely wind up seeing a bit more recommendations from them, but it's still, a lot of the recommendations still wind up sort of being pulled from, I would say, kind of the top 200 charts. How do you feel about podcast discoverability right now?
I think that the podcast apps have made strides to not be an exclusive club. So I think that in, like, let's say a decade ago when I was working in my public radio phase of my career, for me to get a feature for a show that I was working on at the time, it was who do you know at Apple Podcast and their editorial team to get that feature, to email them and pitch them directly.
Yeah.
It's very different now. Now you don't need to necessarily know that. You can go through literally an open public-facing form to submit your show for the editorial team's consideration. That's not a secret. That's not who do you know, who's the relationship you have to be able to get that in front of them, which is great. So that allows people that aren't able or in a position to pay for a service like the Podglomerates to do that on their own. So I think that has opened up more independent creators to get features rather than just the top 200 shows or the top networks and major publishers. On the other hand, though, in the last 10 years, we had, some publications that were pretty regularly featuring podcasts and, having recommendations of those. Like years ago, the Bellow Collective, which is no longer a publication that focuses or is around to be able to highlight podcasts with critical writing. So, there has been ebbs and flows, just like in the industry. There have been peaks where you can see there's been a lot of growth and innovation for discoverability of shows in this very competitive environment.
Yeah.
And then there have been other points where, sadly, due to layoffs or restructurings, it has caused it to be a little bit more difficult for folks to get their show discovered. But I think that's also creating more opportunity for people to be creative about it.
Mm-hmm.
So in the last few years, what I've been seeing is instead of like the standard marketing tactics to get a show in the ears of other new listeners, people are experimenting. Like, can we look at doing maybe like a collaborative episode between two shows, and then one part of the episode is in one feed, and then the second part is in the other feed. So that way, both audiences hear each part and then flip over to hear the second part and become new listeners of the other show in the process.
Yeah.
So you're right. I mean, more podcasts are coming out, especially video podcasts. But it's also worth considering that podcast listenership is also growing year over year. So we're also adding new listeners to the mix to be able to try to, meet the need of all these new shows that are coming out.
Speaking of video podcasting, I'm curious how the rise of video in podcasting has changed some of the sort of internal calculus and conversations that you have at the Podglomerate around how to do audience growth.
Yeah, it's not the same as audio growth, right? So especially YouTube is rolling out new capabilities to accommodate for something we talk about on the marketing team is dynamic ad insertion or dynamic ads. So the fact that you can run a promo or a spot in your audio feed that can run for a certain number of days, a certain number of impressions, and then the technology of the hosting platform can immediately rip that spot out without you touching every episode in your back catalog is phenomenal. And that's the sort of thing that for video podcasts, we want the same capability. So it is a different language or a different dialect, perhaps, of podcast marketing. You have one dialect focused on how you can grow podcast audio. And there's certain words and phrases that carry over to the other dialect of video podcast marketing, but it's not one-on-one. And the other big thing is just how you engage your audience with video. Not every show should be on video. At the same token, maybe video doesn't have to look the same for you and I. So, I know we're on a pretty standard chatcast format right now, but maybe a show isn't like this. So instead of having this video natively at their disposal, they could explore, maybe a graphic designer or an illustrator who is illustrating the video for the audio. And that could be interesting. But I think the bigger question for the podcaster in question, in the heart of this is, do you really want to be on video? What is the value out of you being on video right now? And also, do you have the time and resources to not only focus on your video growth, but also your audio growth? Because those are, again, two separate lines of thought.
Yeah, and I have been speaking with a lot of podcasters who find this very real tension between understanding that doing video can help have their podcast discovered through a variety of ways, whether it's YouTube or the other short clip platforms. But they definitely are hesitant about the extra work that has to go into producing compelling video. Even for this podcast, like you said, very standard sort of chat interview podcast, but I find myself having to spend a lot more time on the editing process because there is a video component. So there is that tension there, I think. And I sometimes wonder whether there's tools, from a software perspective that can make that whole process easier.
Yeah, there are, but a lot of them nowadays are also AI tools. So the fact is that, there are some folks in the industry that would rather not engage with tools that have AI components or fully AI-based products. And that's also a question for them of, yes, you may have like a virtual team, if you will, to help you with an app or platform, but is that something you want to engage with? And I think if anything, we're in the last couple of years with this push to video podcasts or the pivot to video podcast. I think it is going to cause more or less the shows that have the capabilities and the budgets to accommodate for video are going to continue to scale up versus the shows that are more independently funded and are not with a major publisher. It's going to be hard for them to catch up. And so we may be seeing that shrinking of, what would you say, the podcast middle class, I guess, because of this growth in either direction.
I worry a bit about that, to be honest, because that middle class is sort of where a lot of the great podcasts live. So I think that's kind of a challenge for the industry.
Yeah.
I want to switch gears a bit and really kind of dive in on some of the nitty gritty of podcast promotion, because I think at least some of my audience are definitely podcasters themselves, and they tune into this show for, tips. So, Joni, if someone launched a podcast tomorrow with no audience, they could port from somewhere else, maybe very little budget, what would be the first few things you'd tell them to do?
I would first say and ask, who is their audience? And that audience answer could come in many forms. So maybe it's that my audience includes individuals that are based in San Antonio, Texas. Or my audience includes 18 to 30-year-olds who love anime. Or my audience includes, Spanish-speaking individuals. Whatever you would imagine your audience to be, I would say let's then focus on where that audience is.
Mm-hmm.
So if they're based in a certain city or state or region or country, then I would want to look at ways in which we can cross-promote the show with other podcasts that are based in that neck of the woods. Because again, that's likely where your audience is. So for me, based in North Carolina and Appalachia in the Southeast, there's a wide variety of shows of all types that are based in and around my neck of the woods. I would reach out to their shows, their producers, and say, hey, would you like to collaborate on a guest episode or a cross promo where I promote your show for 30 seconds on my feed and you do the same for my show and your show, which are all free tactics. So these are not things that you have to pay for, and they're pretty lo-fi. So you don't have to have a lot of technical experience. You just need to know how to work an email, find an email address for someone, and then exchange scripts between the two of you.
Yeah.
Other things you could consider, though, yes, if you do have the bandwidth to do it, then sending a pitch to local media or media outlets or newsletters and Substacks that cover the kinds of shows or topics that you're doing with your podcast would be great. And that can be a basic pitch of, hey, I am a 20-year historian expert on ancient Roman history, and I have a new podcast where I dive into it. You, Substack writer, cover ancient history. Would you like to interview me or highlight the show in one of your upcoming editions of your newsletter? And here's some additional details and a podcast artwork graphic and a link to our latest episode for you to check out. Personalize it, make it so that it really does resonate with them or why they might be interested.
Mm-hmm.
Likewise, podcast newsletters. So I hope everyone out there, if you're not already subscribed to newsletters like Find That Pod, you're following up with what shows they're featuring. Maybe those are shows in the same genre of yours or lists that they write of the best shows in that genre.
Mm-hmm.
And let them know that you have a new show out and see if they can amplify that or feature you. If you want a list, we actually have a large list of the best podcast newsletters to follow and subscribe to on our website, which is podglomerate.com/media. Hopefully that will give you a sense of the ones that you can pitch to.
SEO is sort of a pretty major part of podcast discoverability, at least I think.
Becoming bigger, yeah.
Yeah, both inside apps and outside of apps, whether it's on the website or in directories. How do you think about that these days? What's the effectiveness of that in terms of, optimizing episode titles, descriptions, metadata? How much has podcast SEO changed over the last couple of years, especially when we sort of consider also the rise of kind of AI-powered search, like ChatGPT and Claude? Are sort of the old strategies still working or something different is more effective now?
Oh, it's changing. I mean, SEO from even a year ago or 5-10 years ago is very different than this month in 2026 at the time of this recording.
How so?
Well, for instance, there's a big update that Google just announced in the last month, so May 2026, at the time of this recording, where they are now going to be pushing their Gemini or their AI search tool at the top of your Google browser whenever you search for an item on Google search. That is going to be the first and biggest element of that response you receive. Of, let's say you ask a question of who are the best podcasters in the business genre.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to be seeing the articles and lists that have accrued SEO, search engine optimization, over the years as the immediate responses under that. You're going to see the AI output of, oh, you asked this question, here are some things we've gathered for you, which is very different. So, I mean, again, that just was in the last few weeks that update has occurred. And so it gives you an indication that the way in which individuals, including podcast listeners, are trying to search out information, including podcast recommendations or resources or capabilities, that's going to be totally different than what would have taken place 5-10 years ago if they did that search on Google or another search engine, or even in the podcast apps. So some things that we've been talking about with our clients to help optimize their show and the show's metadata for SEO, for GEO, which is essentially the AI search. It's just little things like, for instance, getting on podcast lists or listicles.
Mm-hmm.
Those are the sorts of things that AI search engines or prompts or agents, I should say, are taking in and providing those recommendations to users. So if we get our show featured on the best history podcast list by the outlet Podcast Review,
mm-hmm.
then the next time someone searches for that prompt of best history podcast, that specific article will probably pop up, and then that's going to lead that individual to find our show. So more and more we're searching or finding ways to get our show placements and earned media placements, not paid,
mm-hmm.
to allow for those to pop up in AI search flows. As for podcast apps, though, I mean, there's certain things I'd consider. One is the title of the podcast. And does the title of the podcast include keywords or phrases that someone, if they're searching through Apple Podcast directory or Spotify, are going to find? So if your show is just plainly the best podcast or the food podcast, that's okay. But maybe add a few more words to it or a subtitle or tagline to that element of your hosting platform. And that can open that up for more searches. So the show then gets into the results of someone looking for those topics. Likewise for titles of episodes. So if you're not including the name of the guests or the names of major brands or organizations or keywords in the titles of your episodes, do that. Make sure you do that too. As for YouTube, I mean, YouTube SEO is also a slightly different beast. So, I mean, that's a whole different topic. We have some resources on our website about that. But I would just say your thumbnail is important, your title is important, and whatever you're putting in the episode description is important. But that also kind of is true for anything else you do related to your podcast.
Sure. Yeah. It's going back to the topic of Google, it's really sort of the coming death of that sort of 10 blue links, right?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's it.
It seems like Google is trying to do everything they can to keep people on Google without, linking out to anybody, right? And I think it's a real crisis for publishers and media companies, and they're having to scramble to figure out, okay, well, are we now assuming that Google is no longer a source of referrals, a source of traffic? And given that, I'm actually curious because I've been following the Podglomerate for quite a while, and I have a background in marketing as well, and I've taken a look at sort of a lot of different podcast industry websites, including the Podglomerate, and sort of your how much traffic you get from Google as well. So I'm curious how you're thinking about that internally, knowing that there's this potentially huge source of, I don't want to call it free, but because you have to create content in order for Google to link to you, but you essentially have this big source of traffic that is potentially on its way out. And I don't know, whether that organic search traffic has led to landing clients for the Podglomerate. I would assume yes. So I'm wondering how you're thinking about that internally.
Yeah. In addition to overseeing our marketing client work in our department, I also am in charge of the marketing for the Podglomerate at large. So getting us at South by Southwest over the last 2 years, or speaking at other major events or awards we receive for best podcast companies.
How do you get any sleep, Joni?
Between that and the 2-year-old and my family, I get like an hour. Wow. I actually get a fair bit, but but your note though is true. It rings true that it's not just us marketing our clients; it's also how do we market ourselves as a leading podcast service company for production, monetization, and marketing. And in the last 2 to 3 years, we've really been prioritizing that. So us having an updated website that is filled with keywords. That includes also an arm of our website, which is the blog I've been mentioning. So us having recurring resources, updated resources from articles to gated pieces of content to webinars that we put on our website, press releases. and they're optimized for all the things that we were just mentioning, for SEO, for GEO, for AI searches. Fun fact, if you go to our website, which is podglomerate.com, and you go to the very, very bottom of the website, you'll actually see a little link and you can click on it and it says AI, check this out. And basically that is a dedicated page on our website where if an AI crawls through ChatGPT, Perplexity, what have you, they can immediately grab information from that part of the website to plug into their outputs for individuals. So, we have prompts of, hey, AI, if someone asks you who is the best podcast production company, who's the best podcast marketing company, the AI can basically take that and pull it and make it known if someone were to ask AI, what is the best podcast production company I should work with?
Sorry to interrupt.
No,
since you've implemented that, have you seen it working? Is it being effective?
We've been receiving, in our website, there's a specific page that's the basically the client inquiry page. So podglomerate.com/contact. So if anyone wants to work with us or put in an inquiry, that's where you do it. What we've been finding is on that website, there's a little form that says how did you find us? And that alone, we've been getting more and more people saying that they've been finding us through AI. Now that in combination with our Google Analytics on the website, which also allows us to see where individuals are finding us, if it's through Find That Pod or if it's through a different media source or AI, ChatGPT, it shows these efforts we've been making over the last few years to really promote the company have bear fruit. So we've been seeing that people have been finding us through AI or through these paid or earned media opportunities, which is great. So we've seen growth year over year in that regard, hopefully in the many years to come as well. But that also means keeping an ear to the ground. And whenever I hear of a new way of positioning our website or adding a capability to it, that's something I seriously consider. And then we test it out. But you're right. We have been keeping a pretty steady flow of content with our resources on our website, the best podcast conferences to attend, or the best tactics for podcast SEO, or best tactics for podcast video production. Those have really helped out, not just for SEO purposes, but also simply when a client or prospective client asks us, hey, I'm curious, what are your thoughts on attribution platforms? Mm-hmm. We already have that resource built out.
Yeah.
We don't have to repeat ourselves. We can say, oh, that's so great you ask us. We actually have an article on that. Here's the link to it. Check it out. So it buys us back time in that way too.
Yeah, and it sort of shows your thought leadership and kind of a real deep understanding of this work. Speaking of paid audiences and paid acquisition, I know for some time at least, the kind of general consensus has been, at least for independent podcasters, stay away from that. I just saw an article that Ariel Nissenblatt posted recently about paid advertising and how she's starting to change her mind as well.
Facebook ads. I saw that one.
Facebook ads. Yeah. And I've also seen you sort of warn against relying entirely on paid acquisition, which of course I think that makes sense. But I'm curious, at what point should a podcaster invest in paid marketing? Is there some sort of threshold that you look at to be able to say, okay, now you should try this?
Yeah. If you're an independent podcaster, and your time and budget are limited, and maybe you're just starting out, right? So this is maybe V1 of your podcast, and you're not really sure if this is really the final form and shape of it because you're still experimenting with the recording equipment and the format, and you as a host for the first time being on microphone. I would caution that individual to not invest in paid advertising because you're effectively throwing money potentially into a fire. It's going to burn up very quickly. That's not the right time and place to do that. So I would say first is the podcast at a point where you feel like this is a good thing to position in front of people. It is solid. It is consistent not just in the format, but also in you releasing episodes every week or every other week at the same time and keeping that workflow up. And do you have the money to be able to dedicate to it? The other thing is just, again, I feel like this is a broken record moment, but the goals. If your goal is growing retentive audience versus growing, new audience that may not be retentive, because there are advertising platforms or sources out there that will take your money and it may be very inexpensive, but the results of it may be more of a vanity metric where you get, 100,000 listens overnight. Amazing. You get to the top of the charts. Great. But in order for you to continue on that track, you have to continue to feed the beast with money to keep it sustainable. And that's not really, those aren't real people. Those are, maybe one-time listeners. They may be bots, but that's what I would just say, that do your research. We have a lot of paid spend opportunities out there. If you want to do them with podcast feeds, if you want to do them with podcast apps like Pocket Cast will have paid spend advertising on them, or Podcast Addict or Overcast. But go into it knowing a little bit about what you are as a podcast and also what you're going to be getting out of you investing your money in this.
Good advice, I think. Okay, I want to switch gears again, and I want to talk about podcasting, sort of its place in our society. You've been in the industry for a long time.
Yeah.
I have seen you say that, when we look at the 2024 election, that's often cited as sort of the podcasting election.
Yeah.
And that moment sort of changed podcasting a bit in the sense that it became sort of a primary battleground, I think you said, for political discourse and voter engagement. I'm wondering how you feel about that now, because I have mixed feelings on it. Obviously, I love podcasting. I love the fact that it's a system to sort of democratize access to an audience. I can create a show like this and have access to an audience. I wasn't able to get my own TV show or radio show in the past, right? So I like that part of it, but there is potentially a darker side to it, and it's, as you said earlier, the podcast bros. In some ways, podcasts allow people a platform to spread misinformation and disinformation and have an influence because they develop these sort of intimate relationships with their audience. They have this parasocial relationship. They're in people's ears and therefore their brains. They yield a lot of influence. I'm wondering how you feel about that and how you see that's going to evolve going forward.
You're right. And even in the last week at the podcast show in London, which I was speaking at about marketing publicity podcasts, there was a session on AI podcasts and the proliferation of them and how there are so many AI-generated podcasts out there now compared to a year or two ago.
Yeah, I spoke to James Cridland about that recently, and oh boy, he had some opinions.
Yeah, and at the event, Janine Wright, who is the head of one of these new AI podcast companies, actually came out to say, starting this month, we actually are going to stop having AI-generated podcasts that are saying that they are medical experts or legal experts, which, again, you would think the AI didn't go to law school, the AI didn't go through residency in medical school. Why would they say that they're a medical expert? They're not. Yeah. It's not the same as being a doctor or being a lawyer or being whatever educated individual. So, you're right. Misinformation, disinformation, or the positioning of sources where they feel like, well, I'm a reporter, I'm a journalist, or I'm a radiologist. It's like, yeah, you probably aren't, but you have a platform. And having a platform and maybe having the appearance of having larger weight in audience and credible guests coming on or high-level guests, it gives you the appearance of power, and people then think, oh, I should trust your opinion because of it. And that's scary. That is one of the kind of darker sides of just a larger open source media system, is that you have the good being fact-checked, credible sources of information, inspiration, and then the other side being unchecked. So there's no FCC coming in to say you can or can't do this. So it does make the audience the judge of this. And not everyone has media literacy, or not everyone has the time and capability to say that person has an adequate opinion or a well-researched opinion and that one doesn't.
Right.
But you're right. The podcast election of 2024, if anything, it opened the doors to more people thinking, oh, podcasts, that intimate medium that people really invest time and money into, and it can sway opinions, especially young voter opinions, as they're looking to podcasts as their primary source of news and information. That's where we should position our politicians, our high-level individuals. And they're right. There's a lot of power to podcasts, but in the words of a very certain Marvel superhero and their comic book legacy, with great power comes great responsibility, and not everyone abides by that.
That's right. Yeah, that's exactly right. Well, speaking of AI, I think one of the things, at least I saw at South by Southwest, that one of the themes that kept coming up was that in the face of AI, one of the structural advantages that podcasters have is this authenticity, the realness of it. You look at public polling around AI right now, and it's dismal. People
Yeah.
do not want it. They don't want to see the AI slop. They just don't. I sometimes feel like, people that are kind of terminally online, probably like you and me, we live in a bit of a bubble, right? In the sense that, we see AI, we probably use it in some sense. I've talked to podcasters that, some of them hate it. They won't touch it. Some of them use it, but only for things like research purposes.
Right.
But I'm wondering what you think about that sort of authenticity and that advantage. How do you reckon with that idea?
AI is here. Who knows how long AI will be here for? I mean, this does remind me of, in the last decade, we had NFTs as if like NFTs were
Yeah.
going to be the big and only thing. Everyone should invest in this. And now we see where NFTs are now.
Yeah.
So there may be a bubble. The bubble may burst in this AI, sphere. But until then, it is the new trendy thing. And, for better or worse, it also can be helpful in the sense that if, you're wanting a very quick shot of information that is directed to exactly what you're needing. So if I'm planning a trip to Tennessee and I want just, give me some resources on this or an idea, an itinerary, it'll give me some ideas. I personally am going to fact check it. I'm going to vet it. I'm going to also edit it. I'm not going to take it as the V1 and final version. But that's also because I know the limitations of AI, and there's going to be hallucinations in AI. It's not infallible. So at this point, if you're using AI, I'm not going to fault you for it because AI can be helpful, especially as an assistant rather than a full-time employee.
Yeah.
Or an intern rather than a full-time employee.
Sure.
But if you're using it and only using it for certain elements of work, I would just strongly encourage you to think through, is this AI individual that you're hiring effectively really doing something that is never going to have edits or errors?
Yeah.
Because even humans have edits or need edits and have making errors. So I wouldn't fully trust the AI to do something that I could probably do myself.
Yeah. Okay, given your experience and, your sort of intimate knowledge of the podcast industry, if there's one thing that you could change about the current sort of podcast ecosystem, what would it be?
I going back to our original conversation or earlier conversation around fact checking, I wish that there was more of an automation to fact checking through the platforms. For instance, in recent years, you've probably seen on social media like Instagram where a caption may come up on a post or video of a creator to say, hey, their claim that aliens are riding dolphins in the Atlantic Ocean is unfounded and there's no proof to it. That sort of thing could be very helpful in the spread of disinformation, misinformation, especially as we gear up for the midterms in 2026 and the next presidential election in the US in the next 2 years.
Yeah.
Because it is ensuring that an individual clicking on something, a source of truth, the perceived truth, there is actual validity to it or not. But that's just me saying that from my editorial journalism background, that I'd love to see that take place.
Sure.
Otherwise, I'd still love the human elements of podcasts to remain. So while, again, the AI conversation, it can be helpful to some degree, there's a reason why people listen to podcasts and turn to podcasts. And it's because it feels like you are growing and deepening a relationship to another side of, the human ecosystem in a way that you may not be able to see in person for any number of reasons. And if we infuse AI into that and make it AI voices, that's not intimacy with an AI or with a robot. That's just removing it entirely. So that's one thing I just want to say is centering human voices and the human hands that are making these shows come to life.
Yeah. So do you think that fact-checking system, whatever we want to call it, do you think that responsibility should fall on the platforms like Spotify and Apple, or do you think it should be the hosting companies or the publisher themselves, the podcaster?
I mean, ideally, it'd be the publishers and the creators of the shows and the producers and the hosts. Realistically, some of them, and I've heard them speak at many conferences, they do not feel like it's their place to fact check. They think that whatever, they think that, I am positioning myself and my views and my opinions, and whomever's listening should take that with a grain of salt. But this is what I believe in, and the people I bring on my show, even if they are conspiracy theorists, like I'm bringing them on because I want to hear from them. Well, the issue is when you put them on a pedestal where 1 million people are listening to them, that's doing more than just talking to them. That's actually saying, listen to them. They have a credible thought we should consider. So ideally the fact checking would come directly from the individuals involved at the heart of the production. Realistically, I think that is actually more of a hosting platform or app or larger distribution platform, item that would probably come with automation. But
right,
it's the ideal versus the reality of it.
But do you think that taking that hands-off approach, Apple, Spotify, hosting platforms, whatever, like you said, saying, we don't really want to do this. It's not really our job to fact check this stuff. Do you think that potentially will invite, more things like regulation? Let's say we get a Democratic administration 2 years from now. Do you think given podcasting's sort of growing influence and importance, like we were just talking about, in the realm of influencing, young minds in their political views and so on, do you think that will potentially invite some more stringent regulation of podcasting?
Well, I not to get too much in the weeds, because I want to be very clear here. I am not an expert on politics or even the FCC versus big tech. So let me give you my disclaimer of where I'm coming from with my fact checking. But I would think that depending on the administration coming in to power in the coming years, the FCC could be a lever to employ for podcasts, because the FCC, as of right now, really does not do anything with podcasts to, get them in shape compared to like what we've been hearing in recent months of the FCC coming down on Jimmy Kimmel and the FCC coming down on certain broadcast cable news outlets.
But we all know that's politically motivated, right?
Yes, exactly. I do think that maybe there could come into question, we've also seen in recent years that Mark Zuckerberg and Facebook and other social media entities have come to Capitol Hill to, have their hearings on whether their platforms are really set up for the safety and security of people using them. Maybe that could happen with podcast distribution apps and platforms. And the same note of, hey, you are making podcasts or you are distributing podcasts that are causing a swell of disinformation. Do you have any response to that, or how are you going to fix that?
Yeah.
I think it's an interesting question. I think it does go into the ethics of like, who is the one really responsible here, and or is it everyone? And everyone has a role to play in it.
Yeah. Okay, Joni, final 2 questions. First, what are 3 podcasts you'd recommend?
I live my life on a month-to-month playlist. So if you asked me that question a few months ago, I probably would have different podcasts to share with you, or different music recommendations even, because I also love music discovery. Right now for podcasts, I have been listening to a lot of podcasts that focus on like media and podcasting and Hollywood. So very meta, which you mentioned, like being perpetually online. I'm also perpetually thinking of media and Hollywood and pop culture. Yeah. So the ones I love listening to are The Town with Matt Bellany, which is a Spotify Ringer production. That one's about Hollywood and all the elements of it, and that includes podcasts too. Ashley Carmen from Bloomberg, who's the podcast writer there, has been on the podcast in the last year to talk about her research or her reports. So that's one podcast. Another one I would listen to would be the Ankler, which is another media publication, has a podcast called the Ankler Podcast. Another good one if you want deep dive into what's happening in creator economy in Hollywood and television and beyond. And then third and final one, kind of the same, but maybe the cousin of it, the Lonely Island Podcast, the Seth Meyers and Lonely Island Podcast, where comedian late night host Seth Meyers and the trio behind the Lonely Island from Saturday Night Live they rehash all of their digital content they produced over the years through Saturday Night Live. So that's interesting only because it goes through how they were one of the first creators to go big on YouTube with their Lazy Sunday sketch. And from that point on YouTube to where YouTube is today, or digital content and skits, it's amazing to hear the transition and evolution of it. And hearing the behind the scenes moments of the production is really intriguing. So those are the three I'd recommend.
Amazing. And finally, where can people find you online?
Well, they can find me on LinkedIn if they so choose. I'm Joni Deutsch on LinkedIn. They can also follow along the Podglomerate. So we have a free email newsletter that goes out every other week with all kinds of resources, events to bookmark, episodes of shows that can help grow their podcast literacy and industry knowledge. And they can find that along with all of our resources on podglomerate.com or podglomerate.com/blog.
Amazing. Joni, thank you so much for coming on the show.
Sebastian, thank you so much for having me.
Of course. All right. Thanks for listening to this episode of Talk That Pod. Make sure to follow us on all the social places. Just search for Talk That Pod. And if you're not subscribed yet, this podcast is also available on YouTube at Talk That Pod Show. Also, if you liked what you heard, tell your friends about it. And if you really liked it, give us a follow or subscribe on your favorite podcast app. And if you're a podcaster who wants to come on the show, go to talkthatpod.net and submit a request. Finding great podcasts is hard. That's why you should also check out Find That Pod. It's a podcast recommendation newsletter I write every week, bringing you 5 amazing new podcasts you should listen to. Subscribe today at findthatpod.com. Thanks for listening, and I'll catch you in the next one.